Something happened over central Israel in March 2026 that no air defense briefing had prepared for. One incoming ballistic missile became many, and the systems built to stop it did not fire. That single moment has forced a question that no defense ministry in the Western world wants to answer publicly. What happens when a country develops a weapon that does not just defeat a defensive system, but defeats the entire logic that system was built on? Iran's Fattah missile program did not begin as a headline. It began as a development project that Western analysts consistently underestimated, a pattern that has now produced consequences playing out in real time over Israeli cities. The confirmed evidence from the current conflict is this: a significant portion of Iran's ballistic missiles fired at Israel have been carrying cluster warheads, dispersing between 20 and 24 submunitions per missile. Israeli officials confirmed it. CNN documented it visually. The IDF's own assessments acknowledged it. That is not a claim. That is the operational reality of this war, and it changes everything about how this conflict must be understood. Israel's air defense network is not a single system. It is a layered architecture built across 2 decades and designed specifically to handle the missile threat from Iran and its proxies. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets and lower-altitude threats. David's Sling targets medium-range ballistic missiles. The Arrow system engages long-range ballistic threats at high altitude during exoatmospheric flight. Together, they represent the most sophisticated active defense network any country outside the United States has ever deployed. The investment is measured in the tens of billions. The political and strategic weight placed on that network is immeasurable. For Israel, layered missile defense is not just a military capability, it is the foundational assumption of national security under sustained missile threat. What the Fattah cluster warhead campaign has exposed is that the assumption was never tested against this specific combination of threats. Here is why that matters technically. A ballistic missile on a standard trajectory gives a layered defense system a predictable problem. One object, one trajectory, one intercept calculation. The radar tracks it. The fire control computer solves the intercept geometry. An interceptor launches. The problem is defined, and the solution is mechanical. Expensive, but mechanical. Cluster warheads change the geometry of the problem entirely. One inbound track becomes many tracks simultaneously, all descending, all requiring individual intercept calculations, all competing for finite radar bandwidth, finite fire control processing capacity, and a finite number of interceptors available within engagement range. The defense system that was designed to handle one problem is suddenly being handed 15 problems at the same moment. That is not a software issue. It is not a training issue. It is a structural limitation built into the physics of the engagement. The Fattah program itself reflects a deliberate Iranian strategy that has been building for years. The Fattah 1, unveiled in 2023, represented Iran's first publicly confirmed hypersonic glide vehicle. Iranian officials claimed terminal speeds approaching Mach 13 to 15 and a maneuvering re-entry vehicle capable of adjusting course during terminal descent. Western analysts debated how much of that capability was real versus propaganda. The debate mattered less than the direction of development it revealed. Iran was not trying to build more missiles. It was trying to build missiles that existing defensive systems could not engage using their designed parameters. That is a fundamentally different strategic objective, and it took Western intelligence longer than it should have to recognize it as such. The current conflict has provided Iran with something it never had before, a live operational laboratory. Since late February 2026, Iran has fired hundreds of ballistic missiles at Israeli territory. The majority of those missiles have been systems that Israeli defenses were built to handle, but embedded within those salvos, confirmed by official Israeli and American assessments, have been cluster warhead variants designed not simply to strike targets, but to stress, saturate, and degrade the defensive network itself. Submunitions released at altitude do not just threaten the cities below. They threaten the radar systems, the sensor networks, and the physical infrastructure that the entire defensive architecture depends on. Reported radar degradation at key sites during this conflict is not incidental. It is the intended effect. Iran's defense ministry stated publicly on March 5th that it is not deploying all of its advanced systems at once. That statement was dismissed in some Western commentary as bluster. It should not be. It is a strategic communication from a military institution that has spent decades studying how deterrence is constructed and how it can be dismantled. Iran is not expending its full inventory. It is conducting a calibrated pressure campaign designed to identify gaps, exhaust interceptor stockpiles, and force impossible resource allocation decisions on the other side. The economic dimension of that campaign is as important as the military one. An Iranian ballistic missile costs between $1 and $3 million to produce. The interceptors required to stop it cost between $10 and $20 million each. A Shahed series drone costs approximately $20,000. A Patriot interceptor costs $4 million. A single engagement in which one missile forces multiple intercept attempts produces an economic loss ratio that the defending side cannot sustain indefinitely. Reports indicate that at peak engagement rates, certain Allied interceptor stockpiles in the region could face exhaustion within days. This arithmetic is not new. Analysts have discussed it for years in think tanks and policy papers. What the current conflict has done is transform it from a theoretical vulnerability into a documented operational constraint, one that is now shaping real decisions about which threats get engaged and which do not. That last point carries the most dangerous implication. A defense system that must ration its interceptors is no longer a defense system in the full sense. It is a triage system, and triage systems make choices about what survives and what does not. That is a fundamentally different posture than the one Israel's defensive doctrine was designed around. The psychological weight of that shift on the civilian population, on government credibility, on the broader regional perception of Israeli security guarantees, is not measurable in missile counts, but it is real and it is accumulating. Extend the logic to the regional level, and the picture becomes considerably darker. The United States has deployed significant naval assets to the Gulf. It has conducted strikes on Iranian missile production and launch infrastructure using B-2 stealth bombers. Those strikes have been effective in reducing Iran's overall launch rate. By early March, Iran's daily rate of fire had declined sharply from opening levels, a direct result of attrition against its transporter-erector launcher fleet. But the missiles that remained in inventory were being conserved with visible discipline, held back for situations where their deployment would extract the highest possible cost. A country that fires everything immediately exhausts itself and loses its leverage. A country that calibrates its expenditure forces the other side to maintain maximum defensive readiness indefinitely, burning through interceptors and operational cycles without a corresponding reduction in threat. That is an asymmetric advantage, and Iran is deliberately exploiting it. Beyond the immediate theater, the implications extend to every security architecture in the region that was built on the assumption that American air defense systems represented a reliable protective guarantee. Gulf states that have hosted Patriot batteries and THAAD installations for decades are watching the current conflict as a live demonstration of what those systems can and cannot do against a sophisticated adversary that has specifically engineered its offensive capability around their limitations. Every defense ministry in the region is updating its assessment right now. Not in official statements, in classified briefings, in procurement decisions, in quiet conversations about what the relationship with Washington actually provides when tested at operational scale. That recalibration has consequences that will outlast this specific conflict by years. The credibility of extended deterrence, the belief that an American defensive commitment actually protects you, rests not just on the existence of the capability but on the perception of its effectiveness. Perception is formed by evidence. And the evidence produced by this conflict, the cluster warhead detonations over central Israel, the documented strain on interceptor stockpiles, the reported sensor degradation at key radar sites, is the kind of evidence that does not stay classified for long. It circulates, it informs, it changes calculations and capitals that have never publicly questioned the American defensive umbrella. At the global level, the question is no longer whether Iran possesses a credible missile capability. That question was answered. The question now is what the existence of that capability means for the deterrence architecture that has governed Middle Eastern security for 3 decades. Deterrence does not require that a threat be used. It requires only that the threat be believed. And the Fattah cluster warhead campaign has done something very specific to that equation. It has introduced measurable, documented uncertainty into a system that previously derived its entire value from the assumption of reliability. The deeper strategic interpretation of what is happening in this conflict is not primarily about any single missile or any single engagement outcome. It is about the collapse of a foundational assumption. The assumption was that a sufficiently advanced, sufficiently layered air defense network could protect a modern city from a sustained missile campaign launched by a regional power. That assumption drove decades of investment, doctrine, and political commitment. The current conflict has not proven that assumption completely wrong. What it has done, with operational precision and documented evidence, is demonstrate that the assumption has structural limits. And limits in deterrence are not minor administrative problems to be quietly corrected. They are strategic opportunities for the adversary who finds them first. Iran found the limit, not through a sudden breakthrough, but through a methodical program that studied the defensive architecture it intended to challenge and built an offensive capability specifically designed to exploit its structural weaknesses. The cluster warhead campaign is the output of that process. The economic attrition strategy is the output of that process. The policy of withholding advanced systems while calibrating pressure is the output of that process. None of it is improvised. All of it reflects a strategic logic that Western assessments consistently underweighted because it did not fit the expected profile of Iranian military development. What happens next is not resolved. Iran's launch capacity has been degraded by counterstrikes on its infrastructure. Its most advanced systems remain largely conserved. Israel's defensive network remains functional but is operating under strain that was not anticipated at this stage of the conflict. The United States is engaged in a military campaign with no defined endpoint, with domestic political pressures building and alliance management growing more complicated by the week. None of those conditions describe a path toward stable resolution. The systems that failed to fully adapt to the cluster warhead threat before it was deployed operationally will now be forced to adapt in real time, under fire, with cities as the testing environment. That is a harder problem than the one that should have been solved in peacetime. And there is no version of this conflict, no trajectory currently visible, where that problem becomes easier before it forces a reckoning that reshapes the assumptions the entire regional order was built on. One missile became many. The systems designed to stop them did not fire. And the world that existed before that moment, the world where layered missile defense was the reliable guarantee at the center of Middle Eastern security architecture, has not fully returned since.